Hi, welcome back. If you remember last time, we started discussing this management function, specifically some of the processes that actually comprised of management, and the process being planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Now we got to the planning and the controlling part, which are primary management functions, of course. For this lecture, we're going to focus on the organizing piece. Organization is extremely important to accomplishing certain objectives within a company. Depending upon what the goals are for that particular company, there are certain ways of organizing it that can lead to assist in accomplishing those particular goals. So we're going to focus primarily in this brief lecture on the organizational piece and how companies can organize themselves as a way to achieve their objectives. Now first, if you remember, the planning process that we discussed consists of 4 components. We have our planning, where we're establishing our mission, our goals, determining what our strategies are going to be to accomplish those particular goals, developing the actual tactical plans for specifically what can we do at the ground level to accomplish those goals. And we also talked about controlling. How do you measure if you've been successful? Setting up those benchmarks, so to speak, is one of the ways that you can do that. We're going to focus on organizing for this particular lecture, of course. And what you need to know is that there needs to be a logical way to structure the work for people, the way that they do their jobs, the way that they interact with fellow employees. Typically, in most organizations, in order to display the hierarchy and where everybody fits in the organization, they use what are called organizational charts, or org charts is what the common terminology is. And those charts essentially show the structure of the organization. They're boxes with titles and names, and then lines obviously going to another particular box, indicating a hierarchy, right? If you reside in a particular box higher than someone else, and you have a line going down to them, which I'll show you in a few slides here, that indicates that you have some type of authority over them, typically in a supervisory or managerial role, so to speak. So they're very good at showing the chain of command. And this is great because I, of course, in an organizational setting, want to know who I'm accountable to and who ultimately is going to be measuring my performance at the end of some predetermined time period, whether or not it's 6 months, a year, or more or less frequent than that. So from one standpoint, I need to know who can I go to ask questions, and ultimately who is going to hold me accountable at the end of that predetermined time period. Now there's obviously a multitude of different options that organizations have and how to structure themselves, and these typically depend on a couple of different things. The first thing that really needs to be done is there are 3 activities that need to take place prior to even getting to the point to where you're going to establish an organizational structure. And the first component of that is what's known as specialization. Specialization really is the process of identifying specific jobs that are done in an actual organization. And you have to designate who in the organization is going to complete those particular tasks. Once you identify the key jobs, the key functions in an organization, right? What are the things that we need to do to ultimately be successful? You break down those positions into a series of tasks. Doing that allows you to do a couple different things. First of which is, if I know specifically the tasks that are going to lead to my success as a company, I now know ultimately who to hire. What skill sets do I need now in order to be successful? A great thing too is, as we've kind of transitioned through an industrial type economy, we've learned the power of specialization, right? Having someone do one specific task. That's all that they do. Your job is to bolt on this particular part on the vehicle as it goes down the assembly line. Now, maybe it's not very interesting if you're doing the same thing over and over again, but you're going to get pretty good at it just from sheer repetition and doing things over and over and over again. You're going to get very good at that particular task. And so organizations like to do a little bit of specialization because, once again, you're putting people in a place to where repetition is going to allow them to become better at their particular job. So determining in advance, what is our core job function? What is it that we do that leads to our success? And then breaking that down into all of the smaller individual tasks that lead to that core function are the first building block to establishing an organizational structure. Now, once you've gone through that process, the next thing that has to be done is you have to do what's called departmentalization. And really what that entails is determining how to group people together to get the particular jobs done. There's a number of different ways that you can, of course, group people together. And we'll go over a little bit more of what that entails later on in the lecture here. Lastly, the last thing that needs to be done before establishing an organizational structure is you have to, absolutely necessary to, establish a decision-making hierarchy. You have to determine who is going to be responsible for whom, and ultimately who is going to report to whom in an actual relationship, of course. So these are the things that are absolutely imperative to be done: specialization, departmentalization, as well as establishing an organizational or decision-making hierarchy, so to speak. So managers have a number of different things to consider on top of that. Besides obviously determining what the core job is for that organization, besides determining how to group people and who ultimately is going to report to whom, they have to answer a number of different questions, or have to consider a number of different things. They have to consider their goals and objectives. There are certain organizational structures that are conducive to certain types of goals depending upon what they are. What are the types of products that they have? If you have a multitude of different products, maybe it makes sense to have your organization separated and organized in such a way that's conducive to allow people to work on one product at a time, so they can focus on developing that one product versus a multitude of different products. Technologies are really important as well. Technology has changed the business landscape for how things are conducted. That ultimately or importantly needs to be considered. Size is very important. There are certain types of departmentalization that are good for certain sizes of an organization. And if a company gets too big, gets too centralized, they may have difficulty making decisions, and we'll go over kind of what that looks like. And then lastly, competitors, of course. You wouldn't necessarily want your competitors to be more nimble. The higher that your organization is, the taller that it is, the more difficult it is to be very nimble and to make decisions rather quickly. And if you have a competitor who is very nimble, who the decision-making process is much more fluid, then they can ultimately beat you to market in certain areas. So let's talk about some of the key considerations here. One of the things that needs to be considered is the degree of centralization. And this is an extremely important concept that you've probably come across in different courses that you've taken over the years. Centralization has to do with how concentrated decision-making authority is in the hands of a very, very few people. If I were to say an organization is extremely centralized, what that would mean is that top management makes a majority of those particular decisions, and those decisions trickle down the organizational hierarchy, down the org chart, into people that actually implement those particular decisions. Centralization is very good if you want to maintain standardization, if you want everything to be the same, if you want consistency. This is the structure to go. This is a structure that's utilized very heavily in franchises, right? Franchises like McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, Quiznos. Those types of companies, they thrive off standardization because they want everything to be the same. They don't want you to deviate so much because you're going to hurt their brand image, right? When you go into McDonald's, you expect there to be a similarity. If I go to a McDonald's in the Central Valley versus one in New York versus one in Tokyo, it's very similar to me, and that's what they're striving for. But if I went into a different McDonald's in different areas of the world and they were always different, then that may not be something that I would be interested in. Hotels use a centralized type of decision making as well. A lot of hotels are franchises for that matter, but they use a very centralized way of making decisions, or a very centralized structure, because if I go to a Hyatt in Sacramento or one in Los Angeles or one on the East Coast, they want them to be the same. Because I, as a traveler, and everything is new and I'm away from my family, I kind of want some consistency, so to speak. So maybe I want to know that when I get to the room, there's a bottle of water waiting for me, or that, there's turn down service, or that there are certain amenities that I become accustomed to. I don't want to have to guess or try to find out if they're present. And so you would want a centralized type structure in that situation because you're wanting to maintain consistency. You don't want things to be necessarily different, from one store to another. You want them to have the same feel, right? Starbucks has a very centralized hierarchy because they want their stores to have the same atmosphere, the same smells, the same ambiance, the same environment. And what would it look like if you went into a Starbucks that was completely opposite of the image they were trying to portray? And so that's why companies will go to great lengths to maintain a centralized structure. Now, the negative part of a centralized structure, of course, is that it typically takes a long time to make decisions because they're very tall structures. And what I mean by that is you have to, the questions or recommendations or whatever it is, proposals, have to go up a very tall chain of command through multiple steps, so to speak. And so it takes a little bit longer, right? You're not reporting directly to the person who can make decisions. You're reporting to their boss, and they're reporting to someone else, and so on and so forth. So to make decisions, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do and a little bit more time consuming because once again, you're going through multiple hierarchies, multiple levels of management to ultimately make a decision or at least get an answer. Now, not only do taller structures result in a delay of information, right? It takes longer to get information to pass it on or to pass it up or down the organizational hierarchy, so to speak. But it also creates a lot of bureaucracy, right? A lot of tall organizations are government organizations. And so they're very, very bureaucratic, very rigid. And it's difficult to get things accomplished because there are so many procedures and policies for every little thing that you do. I can't tell you how many different forms that we have here at the college in order just to get one thing done. It seems to be a form or at least two for every single thing that can be accomplished. And so that type of bureaucracy obviously makes it more difficult to be nimble and to make decisions much more quickly. Now, with regards to a centralized organization and span of control has to do with how wide a manager's span of influence is. So in a tall organization that is centralized, manager's span of control is very narrow. They don't have responsibility for a wide variety of people because there's so many chains of management, right? Instead of it being a flat organization that's very wide, it's very tall and narrow. So my span of control in a centralized organization is actually much more narrow. I don't have as many direct reports, so to speak, because there are so many different chains of management. There are so many managers that are actually in the hierarchy because I need them since there are so many different levels. Now, if you contrast that with a decentralized organization, right? Decentralized organizations delegate authority to multiple different areas of management. Now, obviously, they reserve certain decisions for top management, right? You don't want lower level managers making decisions that can, have huge implications like, establishing contracts and binding you to certain agreements. That can have a detrimental effect to the success of your company. So you don't want that. But you do want to delegate some authority, right? Because you don't want your employees to have to turn to you for every little thing. Maybe you do, but in some organizations you don't. So you can have a decentralized structure where you delegate authority to different levels so that they have the ability to actually go ahead and make decisions, right? And ultimately, they kind of live with those particular consequences. Now, for a decentralized structure, you have to have accountability, obviously. You can't have people making decisions with no accountability. So there needs to be a way of measuring them and determining whether or not that decision was effective. If it was, okay, that's great. If it wasn't, why? What can we learn from it so next time that mistake isn't made in the future? Now, what a decentralized organization does is it makes the company more responsive because it allows managers to react more quickly depending upon what's going on. And the rationale is that the managers in the local area are more apt to respond to local events than our managers that are back at the corporate office, so to speak, because they're so far removed from the actual situation that it's difficult to respond to. And so speed of decision making is very much an advantage of a decentralized type structure. Now, as I've mentioned before, decentralized structures are what are called very flat, meaning that there aren't multiple levels of management. If you need a good example of this, your textbook has a lot of great illustrations showing taller organizations, flat organizations that are decentralized versus centralized, and also shows you kind of the span of control for some more information. Now, a decentralized organization that is obviously fairly short, right? It also has a wider span of control because you don't have that area of middle management, right? So because you don't have that, your other managers need to have more direct reports, right? Those people have to report to someone. So the span of control in a decentralized structure is much wider than is a centralized type structure for that reason. Okay, which can, of course, get into the issues of there are too many direct reports for one particular person, and do they have the ability to manage all those people? Well, if you're granting authority to your employees and letting them make decisions, assuming they have the knowledge, the skill set, and the education to do so, then ultimately you shouldn't be necessarily bogged down by having so many direct reports. You know, although in years past I've worked personally for organizations that have a very tall type structure, with my managers and employees, I always like to implement more of a decentralized type structure myself. I always enjoyed delegating authority because I felt like if they were trained properly, if I properly screened these employees and that they had the skill set that was necessary, they had the ability to, and I trained them properly, then they should be able to make those decisions on their own. And I didn't necessarily need to hold their hand constantly. You know, plus it gets very time consuming, right? I mean, I looked at it from a standpoint of I hired a person to do a job or to manage a group of people. And if I end up having to do their job, then why do I have them around? And people generally like to have more autonomy, right? They like to have more decision-making authority, so to speak, have a longer leash, for example. And so giving people that essentially contributes to their motivation. People tend to like that, right? We never, in any situation, love it when we're micromanaged and have somebody constantly over our shoulders, so to speak, because it's hard to work in that situation. Not only does it cause you maybe a little bit of anxiety because they're constantly looking at what you do, but it's extremely demotivating because you feel like that they don't trust you to be able to do what it is that you need to do to be effective. So I always enjoyed delegating authority. You know, obviously setting expectations on what the end result was going to look like and letting my employees and other managers determine what was the best course of action to achieve that. And then we would sit down at the very end and evaluate, okay, what was the decision? What was the thought process? What was the result? Was this the desired result? If it was, then great. If it wasn't, then okay, what can we do next time to make it so that we get the desired result? And I find, at least personally, that was much more effective for me. And I had quite a few direct reports. So obviously being very detailed and in everyone's business constantly wasn't very feasible for me, right? I had other responsibilities that I had to actually do, and so I couldn't necessarily do everyone else's job. So, you know, once again, it's a matter of personal preference. A lot of people you'll find like to be very involved and believe that if they're constantly involved that they're contributing and that, you know, there are more chances of being successful. But I think eventually that produces burnout. And as a manager, you can't be involved all the time, I believe. You have to give your people the authority and the autonomy to make decisions because ultimately I think that's what we want as employees and as part of an organization. So let's look at some different parts of departmentalization. You know, we have functional, a product, customer, geographical, as well as So let's kind of go through a couple of these here real quick so you have a little bit of an idea of what they entail. I am going to refer you obviously to the textbook for the course. You know, make sure that you're taking a look at that. There are some great examples of, you know, the different types of structures and showing you in a kind of an illustrative format. So those are always good to take a look at, so to speak. A functional structure, though, really involves grouping people together. And we're talking about departmentalization here. It involves grouping people together by functions. Okay, and functions would be things like sales, marketing, human resources, finance, accounting. The idea is that we're grouping people together by similar skill sets. And so I have all of the accountants in one area and all of the marketing people in one area. because the idea is if I group those people together and have that skill set, what they produce is going to be that much better. They're more familiar with marketing, so to speak. And the people that manage those people are obviously have marketing backgrounds. And so it's a lot easier to do. And this is a very popular structure to organize around business functions here because it allows for specialization, right? I'm going to get really good at marketing if all I do is associate with people that are involved in marketing, and all that I do all day is work on the marketing function. And that's kind of the idea behind a functional way of breaking or grouping employees together. Next, you can have a product type way of departmentalization. This is sometimes referred to as what's known as a divisional structure, or a divisional way of departmentalizing your particular employees or grouping them together, so to speak. And so the idea behind this is that we would organize our particular company around the products that we produce. So say if we produce, the Apple iPad, so to speak, and we have our marketing people there, our engineering people there, our human resources people there, all of our operations people that are responsible for that particular product. And then we have the Apple iPhone, and we have a separate team full of people that have a variety of different skill sets that only work on that product. Now that is very conducive for operations and for manufacturing certain products. And the reason that you would want to do that is that when you're planning the development of a new product, it's better if you have a variety of backgrounds together. Right? If you have just your engineering team working on a particular product, and then they obviously drop the blueprints for something and then produce it and have a prototype, and they ship it over to the marketing department looks at it, says, you know what, this isn't really what the customers want, you need to make these kinds of changes, send it back. Engineering makes a couple of changes, ships it back over to marketing. Marketing then finds some other issues or some other things that are wrong with it. It goes back, and it can go back and forth like this. And you can end up with 20 or 30 different prototypes, and it's very inefficient. So a lot of companies, and this is popular with vehicles, popular with producing electronics. Apple uses this type of departmentalization in that you group everyone together that needs to be associated with that product. So why not have our engineering people, our operations people, and our marketing people in the same room planning the development of that particular product, so they can hash out all the issues that are associated with creating that product in advance, so that we don't create 20 or 30 of them. And ultimately, we're wasting time, money, and energy doing so. And then obviously, there's probably some conflict that's going to take place if you keep sending products that in your mind, as the engineering person with your background from your perspective, that it has everything it needs to do. And the mean marketing people keep putting shots in and chopping down your ideas and different things. And it's great too to have operations, because they'll tell you whether or not it's feasible to manufacture it, right? You can say, well, we can produce it, but this is how much it's going to cost really. It's very expensive to produce. We can't sell this for what we're costing to actually make it. So it can be a little more difficult, so to speak. So sometimes around certain products, it's good to departmentalize by that very reason, because you can group people together with a variety of different backgrounds, and they can contribute to the success of one product. Now you also can group by customer, geography, and process. Geography is very common when you're dealing with international or changes in certain areas, because not all geographies are similar, right? I mean, companies that operate internationally, maybe it doesn't make sense to have one person in charge of marketing for the entire company if you're operating not only in the US, but also in Europe and also in Asia and South America. Because there's different values that go along. There's different ways of marketing. There's different languages for that matter. And so a lot of times it makes sense to have one person in charge of one particular area, because the customers have similar interests. They have similar values. Their social values are the same, right? We talk about sociocultural as being one of those external business environment factors there. And so they have similar values, similar lifestyles, and so it's much easier to develop products catered towards that group if all I focus on is that particular group, versus trying to tailor my product to a multitude of different people, which sometimes never works also. Certain companies also organize themselves around customers. This is very common specifically if you serve more than one particular customer. Maybe you have a, conventional type, the average type consumer, so to speak, and maybe you have a business customer, right? You advertise or market your product to businesses. Obviously, your products are going to be a little different, and the people that need to sell those products need to have different skill sets, right? Business transactions are much lengthier. When you operate and sell a product to a business, it's typically a long-term relationship. It's typically products that are more unique, that are very expensive, and that usually are custom ordered, right? Certain machines and processing and different things. So it's different. Your salespeople need to have a different skill set, right? They need to be a little bit more relational, so to speak, and then maintain that relationship over a longer period of time. So that's one way that you would need to maybe organize your company based upon actual customers. And the last type of departmentalization is process departmentalization. Process departmentalization is organizing employees based upon what they do specifically. This is very common in manufacturing, where you divide people together based upon the operations that they perform specifically. So for example, if it's a manufacturing type organization, maybe you separate them based upon, cutting fabric or dyeing the fabric and then sewing the fabric. And you want to have somebody who's responsible for each particular area because maybe they have a skill set and they're better at certain things, obviously. Once again, you take advantage of specialization because if all I do is sew all day, I'm probably going to get pretty good at it. This works for auto manufacturers as well. For a long time, they organized based upon process, right? All you do all day is one particular thing, whether it's fabricating sheet metal or putting a certain part on a particular vehicle. That's a process. That's ultimately what you do. And so once again, we're taking advantage of specialization because you're doing the same thing over and over and you're going to get really good at it. It'd be really hard not to, right? But once again, our managers that we put in place may be more familiar with that process and can help train, develop, and provide feedback for them. All right, let's take a look real quick at kind of a hybrid way of departmentalizing. There isn't necessarily one or the other. A lot of companies have a multitude of different forms of departmentalization in their organizational hierarchy because it really just makes sense. A lot of times not one cookie cutter way of organizing works. You want a hybrid of multiple things. So in this example, we have first, they're organized based on function, right? You see you have the production president, president of sales, and then your president or vice president, of human resources. So you're organizing based on functions. And then you separate those, right? You have your vice president of sales, and then you have different areas, right? We have, based upon geography, Southwest, Northeast, and Midwest divisions, so to speak. Because maybe the clientele and the customers are different in those areas, right? They have different needs in the Midwest than in the Southwest or the Northeast, different climates, so to speak, different values possibly, different pace of life. And so why don't I have salespeople that are in those areas that grew up there that are more familiar with that clientele? And then lastly, you see that they're organized based upon customers. Not only do we split those offices between two departments, you have your business side and your consumer sales. Because once again, how you sell to a business is drastically different from how you would sell a product for a consumer. Consumers typically buy something one time. And that's it. The relationship sort of ends, so to speak. But business sales is much different. You have to continue to maintain those particular products. You have to develop a long-term relationship because a lot of times these are custom made-to-order products that are very, very expensive. So it takes a different skill set to be able to sell to them. All right, let's look real quick at organizational models here. There are different ways or different ways of establishing a hierarchy or authority based upon organizational charts. And if you were to look at an organizational chart, and if you were to see solid lines going from one box to another, it's very simple. It illustrates a chain of command, right? This person is my supervisor. I report to them. They're responsible for me, okay? You also have, outside of your line managers, whose power is driven based upon where they lie in the organizational hierarchy, you also have your staff managers. Your staff managers can be illustrated by a dotted line in org charts. And those people are responsible for providing advice. They provide assistance, so to speak. They don't have authority over a particular group, but they are experts in their particular field. And, for example, we had at a company that I worked for previously, obviously our legal department was very involved in some of the things that we did, of course. And although as a manager, I didn't necessarily have to do what they told me to do, I almost kind of felt inclined, right? Because they're the expert in the legal realm. I kind of want to defer to them in terms of what would be the best thing to do, because frankly, I don't want to get sued, and nobody does. And so once again, these people aren't necessarily have line authority over you. They can't affect or determine what you do, but they do recommend certain things because they're experts in their field. They do give you advice. Same thing with HR. HR typically doesn't make any hard, fast decisions, but they'll advise you on how to respond to certain situations. They'll advise you on, how to interact with employees so that you can't get, potentially pursued for a sexual harassment claim. And so that's kind of the difference between line organizations as well as staff managers. All right, last thing here we're going to go over is a matrix organization here. A matrix organization provides kind of a combination of things, almost like a hybrid, but it is a little bit different, and I'll explain why. A matrix structure has a combination of multiple different types of structures. And the reason is you're trying to bring specialists in to work on particular projects, but maybe it isn't for a long period of time. This is very common in news reporting to use a matrix type structure because you have multiple different departments necessarily or functions, but you want to have people with certain backgrounds contributing to certain stories, right? So, big companies like NBC Universal or Comcast, which actually owns NBC Universal now, they have multiple different news outlets, right? They're responsible for multiple different, news outlets. They have NBC, which is obviously for television, potentially internet. Obviously, they have an internet site with information on there, magazines, and all those different things that they hold in their umbrella of products. But what makes sense, though, from a hierarchical standpoint, to have people with different skill sets on there. Maybe have somebody who has a business background and they contribute to magazines, books, the internet, radio, and also the television show. Maybe you have someone on there that has a background in, possibly cooking. Once again, that can lend itself to help in those particular areas. So from you can see here, the functional manager has line authority, of course, for these particular departments, which aren't disclosed because it's not really important. And then you have a project manager who really almost works in each particular area, lends his expertise in each particular area. Maybe he doesn't necessarily solely work on one particular area, right? Doesn't work in sales, doesn't work in human resources, doesn't work in finance, but they contribute to those areas because they're the project manager. They're in charge of the actual product. So they work with all of the individual functions to make sure they make the best decisions and ultimately have the most successful results there. So, there really isn't a clear chain of command in most matrix organizations, at least from an up and down standpoint, or at least from a left to right, sorry. Obviously, up and down, the functional manager would be in charge of the particular functions that they're overseeing. But the project manager doesn't really have authority. They're more of a contributor. And that's kind of the idea here. But once again, similar to some of the other structures, we're trying to take into consideration multiple different skill sets into the equation, get multiple different backgrounds in the hopes that we can ultimately make some better decisions as well. All right, that'll do it for now. Please do make sure, obviously I did brush over some other concepts. I try to hit what I felt was the most important things in the chapter and keep the lecture to a reasonable time frame. I don't want to take up too much of your time here. So you are responsible for the material in the chapter, of course. Make sure that you go through that, have an awareness of it. If you have questions or concerns, feel free and let me know. Otherwise, thanks for joining. Have a great week.